Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from page number 17 of the online edition of The Hindu. This article deals with the proposal to establish the Indian Environmental Service or the IES. The establishment of such a dedicated service for environment management was recommended by the TSR Subramanian Committee, which was established by the Environment Ministry in 2014. But now the topic is back in news because last week the Supreme Court was looking at a public interest litigation in which the petitioner was seeking a direction to the government to act upon the recommendations of the TSR Subramanian Committee to provide for the establishment of the Indian Environmental Service. So before we examine the need for such a dedicated cadre of civil servants for environment management, first let's talk about the recommendations of the TSR Subramanian Committee in complete detail. See, TSR Subramanian is a former Cabinet Secretary of India, and under his chairmanship, the Environment Ministry constituted a committee in 2014. The mandate of this Committee on Environment was to review the country's environmental laws and suggest suitable amendments in order to fine-tune these laws so that a better balance could be struck between the conflicting objectives of environment conservation and economic development. As you know, promoting economic growth comes at a cost. As you expand economic activities and create more infrastructure and provide for the establishment of large-scale industries, it is going to extract a huge cost on the environment. Because for such economic activities, you not only need resources, including forest resources, but it also contributes to pollution, which can lead to environmental degradation. So in order to protect our environment from the hazards of economic development, we need a set of stringent environmental laws and forest laws. But at the same time, if the laws are too stringent, it will end up delaying key projects, which in turn can hamper our economic growth. So striking the right balance between these two conflicting objectives is very crucial. And prior to the establishment of this committee, we already had a set of environmental laws to achieve this objective. This included laws such as the Indian Forest Act, the Air Act, the Water Act, the Environment Protection Act, Biodiversity Act, etc. So even though India had the required legal and policy framework, promoting sustainable economic growth and environment conservation always remained a huge challenge for the governments, and it was resulting in either long delays for key economic projects or the poor enforcement of the laws was promoting environmental degradation in order to achieve the desired economic growth. So to review these laws and to fine-tune them, the TSR Subramanian Committee was set up by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And accordingly, the committee submitted a report which consisted of a set of amendments to align these environmental laws with the economic agenda of the government. The Subramanian Committee suggested amendments to almost all the laws we had that covered environment, forest, wildlife, and coastal zone clearances. But when the recommendations of this committee was tabled in the Parliament, a Parliamentary Standing Committee on Environment rejected the report on the grounds that these recommendations, if implemented, would end up diluting our environmental laws, which would then end up promoting hazardous economic activities. So the Parliamentary Standing Committee suggested that the government should constitute another committee which could bring in more technical expertise that was required to deal with matters of environment and biodiversity. And such a committee should be provided with more time so that it could take a comprehensive look at India's environmental laws and suggest suitable changes. But this recommendation of the Parliamentary Standing Committee is yet to be accepted by the government. And considering the controversy, the government is yet to formally accept the TSR Subramanian report. So while this is the current status of the TSR Subramanian report, let us take a detailed look at what recommendations were provided by this committee. See, the TSR Subramanian Committee recommended the introduction of a comprehensive law known as the ELMA or the Environmental Laws Management Act, which would subsume many other existing environmental laws. Under this legal framework, the committee recommended the establishment of full-time expert bodies at the national level and as well as at the state level. These expert bodies have been named as the National Environmental Management Authority and the State Environmental Management Authority, respectively. These national and state level bodies would be responsible for the overall management of environmental affairs, including the grant of project clearance, which would be evaluated by deploying the right kind of technology and expertise. These bodies were supposed to provide for a time-bound mechanism and a single window clearance framework through which proposed projects could be assessed for their environmental impact in order to bring out the cost and benefits of these projects. Based on this cost-benefit analysis, the national and state environmental management authorities were supposed to grant timely project clearance in order to strike a balance between environmental protection and economic growth. In order to accelerate this decision-making process, the committee suggested a fast-track procedure for few select category of projects, such as linear projects, which includes construction of roads, railways, and transmission lines, and as well as for power and mining projects and for projects of national and strategic importance. Along with this, the committee recommended that the existing Air Act and Water Act, which deal with air pollution and water pollution respectively, should be subsumed within the Environment Protection Act of 1986. This was to simplify the legal framework with regard to pollution management and provide for better enforcement of environment protection laws. The committee also recommended that the existing pollution control boards, that is the CPCB, and the state level pollution control boards, would be integrated into the newly constituted expert bodies, that is the National Environmental Management Authority and the State Environmental Management Authority. The committee also recommended the establishment of an appellate mechanism to hear appeals against the decisions made by the environmental management authorities and the Environment Ministry. Even for the appellate mechanism, a time-bound framework was put in place to dispose these appeals within a 3-month deadline so that project clearance is not indefinitely held up for key projects. Then one of the most important recommendations of the committee was the introduction of the Environmental Reconstruction Cost, or the ERC. Since every project causes some damage to the environment, and since there is an environmental cost, this cost has to be assessed before granting project clearance. And based on the extent of damage being caused, the cost has to be recovered from the project proponents by levying a suitable cess or duty on the project. The funds which are generated through this could be channeled into the Environmental Reconstruction Fund, which would be constituted for arranging finance for environmental protection and reconstruction activities. Then to develop the required scientific and technical expertise in the country with regard to environmental management, the committee recommended the establishment of an institute known as the National Environment Research Institute. This institute was supposed to be modeled on the lines of the Indian Council of Forestry Research and Education, which would help in bringing high-end technology into the field of environment governance. Then finally, one of the most important recommendations of this committee was the proposal to establish a dedicated cadre of civil servants under the Indian Environmental Service. This would help the government to recruit the required manpower, which is well qualified and skilled, which could act as a dedicated workforce for environmental governance. It was recommended that such a service could be recruited through competitive examinations conducted by the UPSC on the lines of the other civil services examination in consultation with the Environment Ministry. So these were the key recommendations of the TSR Subramanian Committee, which was brought out in 2014 through a report. But the government is yet to formally accept these recommendations, as the recommendations were rejected by a parliamentary standing committee. So after this, there has been no progress over this report, But however, experts have pointed out that without even formally accepting the report, the government has been implicitly including some of these recommendations by making small and incremental changes to the environmental laws. So, in this context, a petitioner had recently approached the Supreme Court seeking directions to the government to implement the recommendations of this committee, especially with regard to the establishment of the Indian Environmental Service. So, this article helps us examine the merits of establishing such a dedicated service, and hence, let's take a look at the need for an Indian Environmental Service. See, the field of environmental governance is a highly specialized field, and those officers who are part of this governance structure, they need to possess a certain degree of technical expertise, be it with regard to environment conservation, pollution management, prevention and management of environment degradation, biodiversity protection. For all these tasks of environmental governance, you need technical expertise amongst the manpower who would be responsible for implementing and enforcing the environmental laws and regulations. Currently, this is where the biggest challenge lies for India. See, it's not that India doesn't have enough environmental laws and regulations. We have a sufficient legal framework, we have enough laws in place, but there is a lack of enforcement. In the current setup of environmental governance in the country, there is a lack of technical expertise which could provide the right inputs and bring in the right skills for policy formulation and for coordination with various other concerned ministries and departments. As you know, under the current setup, it's the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, which is the nodal ministry for environmental governance. And this ministry is entirely manned by generalists who lack the required specialization. The top levels of the environmental bureaucracy within the ministry and even within other related bodies and departments, key positions are entirely occupied by generalist officers belonging to the IAS or the Indian Forest Service. The ministry does employ a few environmental scientists, but this is simply not sufficient to deal with the task at hand. Hence, there is a need for establishing a dedicated cadre of civil servants who could bring in the required expertise, skill sets, and professionalism to environmental governance in the country. And it is on these grounds that a proposal has been made to establish a new branch of civil service known as the Indian Environmental Service. Now let's take up a related editorial from page number 8, which deals with the topic of environmental clearance. See, recently, the Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has proposed the introduction of a star-based rating system to rate the performance of state governments in granting environmental clearances. The center is hoping that through this star-based rating system, it can incentivize the states to fast-track the process of granting environmental clearance in order to speed up key projects. But this proposal by the ministry has triggered a lot of concerns, and hence, let's understand this topic in detail. See, as we discussed in the last article, when any project is taken up, Environmental Impact Assessment or EIA is mandatory, and the project proponent who has proposed the project has to obtain the required environmental clearances from the concerned authorities. The idea behind environmental impact assessment is to gauge the cost and benefits of the project and to carry out a scientific assessment of the environmental damage that could be caused by the project. Based on this assessment, the clearance could be either withheld or it could be granted by suggesting the project proponent to make suitable changes in the project to minimize environmental damage and to pay compensation in order to cover for the reconstruction cost. Currently, this process of granting environmental clearance is taken up both at the state level and as well as at the center. Projects have been categorized into different sizes, and those projects above a certain size, which have the potential to significantly affect the natural environment, they must be first approved at the state level by the respective State Environment Impact Assessment Authority. This authority is comprised of state level officers who are generalist bureaucrats, and it also consists of a few independent experts. Bulk of the projects which are approved, they fall under this category, which includes building and construction projects, small mining projects, and also small industrial projects which are considered to be less polluting. So bulk of the projects fall under this category and they seek environmental clearance from the state authorities. But for bigger and larger projects which are beyond a certain specified size, and those projects which affect forest land, they are placed under category A projects and they have to be approved by the center. And for this purpose, within the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, a central expert committee is constituted. But since a long time, the central government has been concerned about the slow decision making process at the state level, and this has affected the speed at which approvals are granted for projects, thereby hampering economic growth and development activities. So, in order to speed up this decision making process and to improve India's ease of doing business, the center has come out with a recent proposal to speed up project clearance that is granted by the state level assessment authorities. So, for this purpose, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has proposed the introduction of a star based rating system to rank the states with regard to their performance, which is essentially based on the speed at which they can grant environmental clearances. This star based rating system is supposed to act as an incentive for the states so that they can compete against each other and possibly be eligible for fiscal benefits offered by the center based on their performance. Under this system, states are ranked on a scale of 7, and if they are able to grant environmental clearance for projects within 80 days, they are awarded the full score, thereby giving them a 5-star rating. And if states are granting approvals within 105 days, a lower rank is given, and a further lower rating is given for those states which are granting approvals beyond 105 days. So, through such a metric based system, the center is hoping to rate the performance of states in order to incentivize them and to speed up decision making at the state level so that timely project clearances could be granted in order to promote ease of doing business. So, this is definitely an understandable and justifiable objective of the center. But however, such an incentive based star rating system for the states has also raised a lot of concerns amongst environmental experts. Because they fear that in order to get a better ranking and to be eligible for better benefits from the center, state governments might hastily grant approvals without carrying out the comprehensive impact assessment that is required. It's also important to note that the state level environment impact assessment authorities, they already have a shortage of skilled manpower, and they not only have very few independent experts on board, but also the state level bureaucrats, they lack the required expertise, which has ended up slowing down decision making at the state level. So when the states are already facing a manpower crunch, and when they are already lacking the required expertise with regard to independent experts and state level officers, if a time based rating system is introduced to evaluate their performance, then there is a high likelihood of states skipping the important site visits that are needed to carry out thorough impact assessment. And in order to meet the stiff deadlines, they might start granting hasty approvals, which could end up having a disastrous impact on the environment. Hence, to address these concerns, the editorial is suggesting a suitable way forward. First, the editorial is acknowledging that carrying out environment impact assessment is a very hard task and a time consuming task, and prolonged delays are definitely unacceptable as it delays the projects unnecessarily, and this could also have a huge socio-economic impact. So, to ensure that timely approvals are granted without compromising the environmental objectives, it is of utmost importance for the states to start recruiting more independent and competent experts who can bring in the right skills and technical expertise and who can function in a fair manner without any fear or without favoring any industry, so that the environmental concerns can be balanced with the economic objectives. Increasing the expert manpower will help in speeding up the decision making, and it will prevent the need for seeking hasty approvals just for the sake of obtaining better ratings. So, if the state appraisal committees scale up their competency and their capabilities, then Such a star rating system can definitely help in incentivizing the states and their performance. Upon this, the states also have to build the required trust with all the stakeholders, including the industry and the local people, especially the indigenous communities, so that they have enough faith in the system, which will help the industry and as well as the local communities to trust their respective governments to protect their interests. So, such suitable measures will have to be first implemented because otherwise, a deadline based star rating system will only lead to hasty approvals being granted, which will end up seriously harming our environmental objectives. Now, let's take up another editorial from page number 8 that deals with the debate between merit versus reservation. See, the merit versus reservation debate is a long standing debate that has engaged both public and judicial discourse for years. There have been strong opinions in favor and as well as against both merit and reservation, especially from the public. And quite often, the judiciary has also made some important observations regarding this debate. This debate has come up again because recently the Supreme Court ruled in favor of extending the OBC reservation quota to the All India category of seats under the NEET examination. See, NEET, which is the entrance examination for undergraduate and postgraduate medical and dental courses, did not have any OBC reservation until recently. The provision was proposed last year with 27% reservation for OBC category within the All India quota of seats. With regard to medical admissions in the country, this All India quota was implemented from 1986, where a central pool of seats are made available for medical and dental courses, which is available to students from across the country, irrespective of their domicile status or irrespective of the state that they are coming from. This quota comprised of 15% undergraduate medical and dental seats and 50% PG seats, which are surrendered by the states for admission through the central pool. For nearly 20 years, there was no reservation in this category. But in 2007, the judiciary allowed the introduction of reservation at 15% for scheduled castes and 7.5% for the scheduled tribes. Then even when OBC quota was introduced in central government institutions, there was no such quota in state medical colleges. So to address this anomaly, OBC reservation was introduced in the All India quota category as well last year, and this was challenged at the Supreme Court. And now the Supreme Court has upheld the OBC reservation in the All India quota category, thereby extending affirmative action for the disadvantaged and backward classes in medical and dental admissions as well. But however, the editorial focuses on a key observation made by the Supreme Court while passing this judgment. See, generally when there is a debate between merit and reservation, it turns into a binary debate where an individual is either pro-merit or pro-reservation. So essentially, this has always been a black and white debate. There has been no gray areas. It's always been seen in the sense that either you're pro-merit or you're pro-reservation. Conversely, it means that if you're pro-reservation, it is assumed that you're anti-merit. But the Supreme Court has observed in its latest ruling that the debate between merit and reservation is no longer a binary debate, and the court has concluded that merit and reservation have become superfluous. So let's understand what the Supreme Court means by this. See, affirmative action or reservation has been granted in our Constitution to help the socially and educationally backward classes, and this has been granted as an exception to the rule of equality. Article 14 of the Constitution guarantees right to equality. This is further exemplified under Article 15 and Article 16 as well. Under these articles, the state is prohibited from discrimination, and the state is committed to creating equal opportunities. But however, there exists an exception to this equality rule, which has been enabled through the policy of affirmative action or reservation to socially and educationally backward classes, such as the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, and later the OBCs. Then more recently, the government has introduced economic criteria based reservation as well for the economically weaker sections. So the grant of reservation has always been an exception to equality and this benefit has been granted as an exception only to the most deserving communities. But now, the Supreme Court seems to have concluded that this distinction no longer holds good, as we are seeing the emergence of substantive equality. It essentially means that granting affirmative action is just another facet of equality and not an exception to the rule of equality. The Supreme Court has called it formal equality, where everyone is competing on an equal footing, and those who are socially, educationally, and economically deserving, they are granted the benefits of reservation to help them overcome their disadvantages. So, this has led the Supreme Court to conclude that the granting of quotas to certain categories automatically grants them equal opportunities. But the editorial disagrees with this opinion of the Supreme Court and says that this observation of the Supreme Court has dealt a blow for affirmative action. Because, see, despite the policy of affirmative action and reservation, social inequalities and inherent disadvantages, they continue to exist in the Indian society. This is primarily an outcome of the caste-based nature of the Indian society, where different groups of people have a different social status, which in turn decides their access to essential services like education and as well as their performance. See, this is where you need to understand that the argument being made by the editorial is not an argument against merit. It is an argument being made in favor of reservation for the deserving, while seeking to establish the fact that by merely extending reservation, you cannot guarantee equal opportunity in the Indian society. Because the educational performance of a candidate or their merit is purely determined on the basis of one's marks. While there is no doubt that a candidate scoring well would have definitely put in a lot of effort, it does not take away the fact that merit and marks, they are determined by the social and cultural capital that a candidate has access to. A candidate coming from an upper class automatically enjoys better access to schooling and good education, and there would be an inherent family drive to strive towards excellence in education. Whereas the exact opposite holds good for the less disadvantaged, where their caste, their family background, and the social cultural capital they inherit plays a direct role in influencing their educational performance and subsequently their performance in competitive exams. So, while meritorious students definitely need to be recognized and be given the right opportunities, it would not be entirely correct to argue that just by merely extending reservation or affirmative action, you can guarantee equal opportunity in a caste-based society. Next, on page number 8, we have a column written by Dr. C. Rangarajan, the former governor of RBI, and D.K. Srivastava, a leading economist, in which they argue that the upcoming union budget provides an opportunity to the government to support growth and fiscal consolidation. First, they bring out data from the RBI, IMF, and the Ministry of Finance to show how deeply the Indian economy has been hit by the pandemic. Based on this data, they argue that 2 years of real economic growth has been wiped out by the COVID-19 pandemic. And now, as the pandemic slowly subsides in its severity, and as economic activities are fully opening up again, there lies an opportunity for the government to grasp the growth prospects that lie ahead by providing the right stimulus in the upcoming union budget. To realize these growth prospects, the government will have to extend the right benefits to key sectors such as the MSME sector to not just drive GDP growth but also to drive Indian exports. The triggering of such economic activities will also bring in additional revenue to the government so that it can meet its increased expenditure, which has gone up significantly ever since the pandemic broke out. As the government has increased allocations for health, and as it has come out with large stimulus packages for various sectors, there has been a significant jump in government expenditure, which has been putting a lot of pressure on fiscal consolidation. So going forward, the government will have to look at ways to sustain the right kind of stimulus that is needed to support growth, while curtailing unnecessary expenditure in order to quickly bring down the fiscal deficit and achieve fiscal consolidation. But this would require the government to prioritize its expenditure through the budget and focus on critical schemes like the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which is an ambitious scheme of the government to support infrastructure creation in the country. Then it will also have to focus on the rural economy, especially on rural demand. And for driving up rural consumption and economic activities, it will have to increase the purchasing power in the rural areas through the budget by focusing on schemes like Manrega and by providing it with higher allocations. Now let's take up the last article for today by looking at this column from page number 9, which focuses on budgetary allocation for the education sector. The writer says that as we enter the budget season, the subsequent budgets of the central government and the state governments will help us understand the true extent of public spending or public expenditure on the education sector. The writer points out that currently it is astonishing that there isn't sufficient data available to indicate the exact extent of public expenditure on education sector. This lack of data on public expenditure on education comes at a time when the education sector has faced its gravest crisis following the breakout of the pandemic. The pandemic has disrupted learning across the world as it led to the closure of schools and colleges. The sudden and dramatic shift to online learning has further aggravated the digital and income divide in education, thus making it all the more important for governments to spend adequate amounts on the education sector to bridge these divides. The current data on public expenditure on education is not very reliable because there are huge differences between central data and state level data. Most states in India are spending below that of middle income countries on education, and their allocation for education stands in the range of 2.5% to 3.1% of the state's income, that is, in relation to the state's GDP. This is much lower than what middle income countries spend on education, and it compares with 4.3% of the GDP that is spent by lower middle income countries on education. This goes on to show the low priority that education receives in state budgets, and it is quite shocking and inexplicable that even the union budget over the last 2 years has reduced public spending on education in net terms, despite the education sector facing a grave crisis during the pandemic. The writer points out that studies have shown that India's spending on education falls way below UNESCO benchmarks, and there is an urgent need to scale up public spending on education and also to bring out reliable data in this regard. Because as per the economic survey of 2020-21, India was spending just around 2.8% of its GDP as of 2018-19. Whereas the Ministry of Education, on the other hand, has claimed that India's public expenditure on education stands at around 4.3% of the GDP. So there is a stark divergence in the numbers being brought out by the center, and the data offered by the states is also not entirely reliable. So in this context, the writer is calling upon the governments to make use of the upcoming budget sessions to bring in more transparency and reliability to help us understand the extent of public spending on education. And the writer is also calling upon the governments to step up public spending on education on a war footing, considering the massive disruption that has been caused to education by the pandemic. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: examine the recommendations of the TSR Subramaniam Committee report on environment and evaluate the merits of the proposed Indian Environmental Service. The second question: assessment of environmental costs and benefits of projects should not be done in haste. Comment. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.